Nazi Germany, two words synonymous with barbarity, terror, hate, and death. A shock defeat in World War I sows the seeds for discontent in a once prosperous nation. Adolf Hitler, an unassuming, uninspiring man, seizes the opportunity to take control, promising to make Germany great again. But he won't do it alone. Willing accomplices rally from the most unlikely of places. The female Führers, Nazi she-devils, cougars, fantasists, and secret lovers. These are the forgotten Nazis. These are Hitler's handmaidens. In the dying days of World War II, Private Willie Anderson was dodging bullets fired from a sniper's nest in the once picturesque German town of Aachen, 500 kilometers southwest of Berlin. When his comrades took the shooter out with a bazooka round, what they discovered would haunt Willie for the rest of his life. Because the body they found wasn't the die-hard Nazi soldier they'd expected. It was a young girl. As the GIs picked through the ruined city, they likened it to a butcher's shop, with pieces of human meat lying everywhere. Much of it from the bodies of the young girls who died defending their hometown. What kind of madness had inspired Germans to send their daughters into a slaughterhouse? Nazi Germany is a horrific enigma. Who do we blame for what's been described as the politics of organized insanity?
Und muss sagen, den Frieden wollen wir, aber diese ununterbrochene Entrückung lehnen wir ab.
Adolf Hitler is an easy target, but he didn't do it alone. Without willing accomplices, he might just have been another demented dictator spewing hatred from his soapbox.
Und den deutschen Arbeiter.
To lay his empire's foundations, Hitler had to rally more than just Germany's men to his cause. Women had been called the architects of National Socialist Society, and Hitler knew he needed them if he was going to build a 1,000-year Reich. As Hitler and his henchmen led the nation to war, his handmaidens would indoctrinate a new generation of good little Nazis. These were the female Führers: Leni Riefenstahl, Magda Goebbels, Gertrude Schultz-Klink, and Jutta Rütiger. Together, they would spawn the mother of all evil. After Germany's humiliating defeat in the First World War, crippling economic sanctions sent the nation to the brink. In 1921, there were 64 marks to the dollar. Just 2 years later, it was 4 trillion. Families starved as skyrocketing inflation saw people paying for a single loaf of bread with a wheelbarrow stuffed with banknotes.
Through the Weimar era, it was the women at home that saw all the violence on the streets, that witnessed all the political and social chaos. So the women probably understood more so than ever what a bad thing the Weimar Republic actually turned out to be.
I think after World War I, Germany was in a very difficult place and people were looking for a more positive future.
Onto this rickety stage stepped Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party.
Eine große Zeit ist es.
Their brand of rabid nationalism would transform German society and write one of the darkest chapters of human history. At the center of the Nazi vision for the future was the ideal Aryan woman. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and physically robust, she was a wife and mother above all else. It's more than a little bizarre that Hitler, a sickly, paunchy, dark-haired man, championed a physique so far removed from his own. It's less of a surprise that Hitler's ideal society revolved around a mother figure.
Hitler's relationship to women appears to have been extremely complicated. So we know from the records that he had this Oedipus complex where he just so adored his mother and so hated his father, that this also really contributed to messing him up in extraordinary ways.
Certainly no one here ever dreamed that the skinny son of the Hitlers would someday be the supreme dictator of one of the greatest nations of the world. Surely his father and mother, simple folk of this village, would have been the last to vision such an incredible future for their boy.
I think it's really significant in terms of his wish to venerate women and respect them, but there's also a very opportunistic aspect, which is that he wanted the reproduction of Aryan children.
After the First World War, women had been given the vote and encouraged to work and pursue higher education. But to Hitler and his henchmen, that progress was a hangover from the despised Weimar Republic. Worst of all, many of the intellectuals lobbying for women's rights were, you guessed it, Jewish. The Nazis wanted to turn back the clock. Hitler was going to emancipate women from women's emancipation. According to his warped way of looking at the world, women had little to fear from so-called oppressive men. Instead, their mortal enemies were Jews, Bolsheviks, and feminists.
I think the Nazi propaganda machine was incredibly effective, and using the Jew as a scapegoat, as the poison container for all the ills in the world is so convenient. It actually allowed Nazi men to divert Nazi women's potential anger that they were being robbed of various rights and opportunities in the workplace, and direct that anger and sense of grievance towards Jewish women.
In 1933, when the Nazis proposed abolishing women's right to vote, there was little pushback. Most young German women thought feminism was old news. They had more pressing concerns. After the Great War, Germany's male population had been served up a big slice of humble pie. And their women, their Fraus, were in desperate need of a new generation of heroes. They liked what Hitler had to say about a return to traditional values. Women were to be pushed out of the workforce and back into the home and the domestic nirvana of Kinder, Küche, Kirche.
Kinder, Küche, Kirche has always been women's job in Germany. That means church, kitchen, children. And this is what women were responsible for.
It was almost like guidelines for German women to have as many German children as possible, to create a comfortable home environment so that the men who had been out perpetrating the Holocaust, committing crimes, murdering people, could come home into a nice, comfortable environment. And the church to give them a faith, if you like, a collective.
Über eine 5-jährige Aufbauarbeit des nationalsozialistischen Staates.
Within months of taking the reins of power, Hitler swung the axe on hard-won freedoms for women.
Zu der langsamen Aussöhnung, nicht nur zwischen den Menschen in Österreich selbst, sondern
University admission rules were changed so that only 1 in 10 students could be a woman. All female public servants were given their marching orders. And female lawyers, judges, and doctors were banned. But Hitler didn't stop there. The non-smoking and teetotaling Führer added drinking and smoking to the growing list of no-go zones for women.
The women, they were not allowed to use makeup. Perms of the hair were outlawed. Dyeing of their hair was outlawed. They weren't allowed to wear clothing that would accentuate the body's shape. Flat shoes, no stilettos. They were just indoctrinated in banality.
It's tempting to dismiss these edicts as yet another example of Nazi control freakery. But beneath this madness, there was a pernicious method and, as always, a hidden agenda. Jewish women had been at the forefront of the independent women's movement. They were also prominent in German medicine, law, and education. Convincing women to leave the workplace and return to the home, however, would require quite a bit of spin. Luckily, Hitler had just the man for the job. To create a 1,000-year Reich, Hitler and his Nazi regime needed women to stop working and start making babies. It was going to be a tough sell after the progress made during the Weimar years. But Hitler had the perfect spin doctor, Joseph Goebbels.
Das wird der Feind in den nächsten Wochen und Monaten zu verspüren bekommen.
It wasn't that Nazis thought women were inferior to men, he said. They were simply born with a different skill set that meant that they could fulfill a crucially important role as mothers of the Reich.
They were caught up in this wonderful, wonderful idea. We are creating this new Germany. Just like the men are digging roads and putting down motorways, just as the men are joining the army, we are helping New Germany by providing a good home for them to come back to, by providing children for them. This is our duty, and it was universally accepted.
Joseph Goebbels led by example by lining up his own perfect Frau, Magda Goebbels, First Lady of the Reich. Tall, blonde and blue-eyed, with 7 picture book children, Magda was a favorite of the Führer and a Nazi poster girl.
Magda Goebbels was the mother, I suppose, of the whole country since Hitler didn't have a wife. And she was charming, she was beautiful, and all of her children were named H after Hitler, of course.
From day one, it was all about keeping up appearances. Any dictatorship worth its salt needed its myth-maker-in-chief. Ironically, for a regime that claimed to want women chained to the kitchen sink, Leni Riefenstahl did more than almost anyone else to package Nazi ideology and sell it to the masses. And she did it by conquering a male-dominated field. Riefenstahl's own career began in front of the camera, but it wasn't until 1932 that she caught the eye of a politician who had thwarted artistic ambitions of his own. Hitler recognized in Riefenstahl the skills needed to capture the Nazi dream on film and beam it into cinemas across Germany.
Leni Riefenstahl was brilliant. In the 1920s, black and white, she made mountain movies and she climbed the mountains herself. And Hitler saw her as a genius. He liked film, he was a good film critic, and he said, that's who's going to make my film for the Nuremberg Rally and for the Olympics. And you watch the film and she is a genius.
Hitler recruited Riefenstahl to make a short film that would paint a picture of Germany's glorious rebirth on a grand scale. In 1933, she directed The Victory of Faith at the annual Nazi Party rally at Nuremberg. It was a test run for Triumph of the Will, the film she'd make at the same rally the following year.
Nazism has held its great convention. Masses of uniformed men, stupefying to the eye and incredible to the imagination, have stood in spellbound audience of the Führer.
It would be acknowledged as the most powerful propaganda film ever produced. And in 1936, her film Olympia captured the Berlin Games and projected images of an ascendant and powerful Germany around the world. Riefenstahl glorified the Germany of days gone by, with rosy-cheeked maidens in folk costume celebrating the harvest while their men did manly things. Her films seemed to usher in a return to the Golden Age, and they were a crucial ingredient in Hitler's plans to brainwash the nation.
If you look at some of the Leni Riefenstahl films, and they always center, of course, on the young, the attractive, the physically attractive women, but they all got these faces that are, they're really in love with whoever this person is in front of them talking. That person happens to be Adolf Hitler.
He was like a pop star of his era, like a George Michael of his era almost. I mean, girls would go hysterical to get near him, to just touch him, to shake his hand.
It beggars belief today, but Hitler believed an important part of his appeal was that women found him sexually attractive. That meant he had to maintain the illusion of availability. So he remained childless and kept his relationships with women on the down low.
I think Hitler hid his relationships partly to embody a kind of pure masculine ideal, someone who wasn't encumbered by domesticity, by a wife or a girlfriend, and he became this almost personification of masculinity. Also, a bit like a celebrity or pop star, it allowed other women in the general population to fantasize that they would be Hitler's girlfriend or wife.
But when it came to involvement in the machinery of government and national leadership, even those women who publicly stood by his side and helped the party rise to power were left in the dust, like all his hidden lovers.
First, the Nazis had no idea who was going to be in charge of women. They had men lined up for all the important jobs, at the head of the party, at the head of the state, foreign office, the cabinet member, and they had no women.
There was a heck of a lot of devotion to Hitler in the 1920s, and yet a lot of the women who voted for Hitler, and they did, you know, can't make too many bones about that, they did vote for him. But how did the Nazis repay these women? They repaid them by severely limiting their involvement. I think there were 17,000 women civil servants prior to Hitler coming to power. Before the end of the year, they'd all gone. Women teachers, they were reduced by nearly half. Women musicians, all gone unless you had a certificate from Goebbels' propaganda party.
Still, Hitler knew that he needed a figurehead to marshal the women of the Reich, even if she was a leader in name only.
And they had a problem. If the woman had a husband, then her first duty was to a husband. And that didn't work because she wouldn't have time to take over control. What were they going to do? And so they looked and looked, and they found a leader in a little obscure place in southwestern Germany, Gertrude Schultz-Klink. And she was a widow. Not only that, her husband had died on the battlefields in World War I, and I think she had 7 children. Perfect. She also was blonde, blue-eyed, and very compliant. And she was the woman leader for the entire time. And all of those independent leaders from the old days just faded away.
When Hitler appointed Schultz-Klink as the Women's Führer and put her in charge of running the Nazi Women's League, or NSF, she had virtually no leadership experience. And that suited the men at the top of the party just fine. Klink was excluded from important policy meetings, and although she was often seen by Hitler's side, she was never consulted on any decisions affecting women. That didn't trouble Klink, though, because at least in name, she was playing a key role at the forefront of Germany's resurgence.
There was pageantry around everything. Everything was stage managed. Every parade had floats. Uniforms were everywhere. Music was everywhere. And just remember, by 1936, Germany was the only country in the world that recovered from the Great Depression. There was full employment. There was rearmament. Germany was back on the road to prosperity. And the women, according to Schultz-Klink, were very proud that motherhood was valued again.
By 1939, the Nazi Women's League had 2 million members. During the war, a further 11 million joined its ranks.
Well, the German women, with all the various associations that was in existence, I mean, all the Nazis did really was to bring these under a single authority, which obviously was the Nazi Women's League. And the women weren't too concerned about that. They were still able to operate, but they were just brought more or less under the direct control of the Nazi state. They weren't actually stopped from doing these things.
It all played into Hitler's grand plan to build a master German race. Change wouldn't happen if Nazi thinking was confined to the halls of power. It had to worm its way into German homes as well.
The way that the German Women's Nazi League sort of operated, I mean, the German youth, for one thing, people like Gertrude Scholz-Klink, she would come and visit the schools and they would discuss politics. And they'd be asked questions from Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, for example. If they couldn't answer the question, then it was pretty much frowned upon. So, yeah, they did a lot in indoctrinating the youth of Germany.
The Nazi Party really encouraged the ideal woman to marry and to have children. And to enable that, there were marriage loans to help you pay towards the cost of your wedding and setting up a home. And then if you started having children, you wouldn't have to pay back a certain amount of your loan. And I think 4 children would wipe the loan off in its entirety.
The incentive kicked off a rush to the altar, and mass weddings became the in thing. More than 100 female employees from the Riemster cigarette company were married to their new husbands in a single ceremony.
Always with uniforms, always with honour guards, and with dignitaries from the local Nazi party there to help them on their way. They were encouraged to say, this is my role, I will get married. Giving birth to children, that was the key. That was the element that they wanted to push. So marriage was a means to an end.
And those women who had hoped to marry a member of Heinrich Himmler's SS were held to a higher standard. Himmler believed his men were the racial elite of Nazi Germany. So he was keen for his men to spread their seed. But the women who wanted to bear their children had to prove their pedigree.
Himmler was the most thoroughgoing racist, that is, of all of them. And for his SS men, he demanded absolutely Aryan wives.
So every SS man that wanted to get married had to have his marriage personally approved by Heinrich Himmler. And it involved reams of paperwork. You had to send in on both sides your birth certificates, your parents' birth certificates, your grandparents' birth certificates. You had to send in documents to show you had a clean bill of health.
After that, they were expected to sign up for training at one of the elite Reich bridal schools that Himmler and Gertrude Scholz-Klink had founded together.
Himmler was very much in favor of elite schooling for SS wives or mistresses, and they had to go to special schools called Lebensborn. And these schools were in the Alps. They were beautiful chalets. They were super luxe.
And being Nazi Germany, no educational program would be complete without lessons in racial theory and eugenics. Fairy tales were tweaked so they communicated the right messages to impressionable baby Nazis. Before graduating with the certificate they needed to walk down the aisle with their SS groom, the wannabe Nazi brides had to pledge their undying loyalty to Hitler. They even had to memorize a bedtime prayer to teach their children. My Führer, I know you well, and I love you like my father and mother. They were taught they had no agency over their own bodies, that they belonged to the Reich. And it was their responsibility to keep fit, so they were ready to perform their ultimate duty, to bear children.
This was seen, the fact of particularly of a young woman's body becoming property of the state and the Führer. This was seen actually as a great honour to many of them. It wasn't seen as something dirty. This was a real honour to be considered as such. But certainly the younger ones, they were extremely patriotic, extremely excited about this 1,000-year Reich and how Germany's going to be wonderful again.
Get them young, keep them old. That was Hitler's dictum. You know, you get them at a young age and they'll stay with you right to the end. They were very clear. We get them very, very young. We don't make it voluntary, we make it compulsory. So every girl in Germany has to belong to this, just like every boy has to belong to the Hitler Youth. And it created soldiers for the Reich, for the Wehrmacht, and it created wives for the men who would then propagate children, and that's more soldiers for the Wehrmacht.
Adolf Hitler saw Germany's mothers as his secret weapon. They were his advanced troops readying the ground for a Nazi campaign of shock and awe that would engulf the world. In Nazi Germany, there were two roles for women: care for the household and making Aryan babies. To incentivize both, the Nazi propaganda machine went to work celebrating mothers as the crowning glory of the Third Reich. The ultimate reward for Nazi mums was the Mother's Honor Cross, a pin to be worn in public that would help boost their pension, score the best seats on the bus, and park in pole position at Nazi events.
The German Mutterkreuz, or the German Mother's Cross, was a German award created specifically for the German mother. And it was graded in bronze, silver and gold. Bronze was for a woman who had 4 children, silver was for a woman who had 6, and gold was given to a woman with 8 children.
Predictably, the first woman to be awarded the Gold Mother's Honor Cross was Magda Goebbels, the First Lady of the Reich and mother to a swarm of Nazi children. Nazi women were being asked to breed like rabbits because Germany, like its European neighbours, was in the midst of a population crisis. 1 in 20 Germans had died in the First World War, many of them young men in their prime. More concerning was the fact that during the conflict, birth rates halved. As Heinrich Himmler put it, too few children meant a one-way ticket to the grave. Without a wave of baby Nazis, the 1,000-year Reich would remain little more than a pipe dream.
Contraception was outlawed, abortion was outlawed. Hitler and Goering and Goebbels, they realized they needed numbers, pure numbers, if they're going to push for Lebensraum.
The Spring of Life, or Lebensborn program, was the Nazi way of incentivizing childbirth under any circumstance. It offered Aryan women financial assistance and adoption services in a series of private maternity homes. These even included single young women who had fallen for the charms of SS stormtroopers.
So Himmler set up homes for these single women who were impregnated by SS men. The Lebensborn program is part of that. It's about trying to support the German women who are having these babies and provide them these subsidies and provide all this kind of health care and to promote that.
In most European countries, unwed mothers were vilified, but not in Nazi Germany. Here, the contents of their wombs were precious. Mothers in the program were supported if they decided to keep their babies. If not, they could foster them to an SS family. Whether it was in their women's leagues or the green countryside of the Lebensborn program, Nazism was a cradle-to-grave proposition for the future wives and mothers of the master race. After receiving their first lessons in Nazi indoctrination at their mother's knees, young German girls moved into the classroom. Nazi officials had purged all Jewish or politically dubious teachers from the school system. And, of course, all anti-Nazi material and books by Jewish authors were consigned to the flames. And the training didn't stop when the school bell rang at the end of the day.
Bunddeutsche Mädel, which was the League of German Girls. That was basically a Hitler Youth organisation for girls. Now, you had two, it was basically a two-tiered Hitler Youth organisation. You had the Young Mädel Bund, which was the Young Girls League. Now, this catered for girls from 10 to 14 years of age. And the teachings, all the political ethos of the party, etc., would be taught to them. And then when they came to the age of 14, they would transfer into the Bunddeutsche Mädel, which was the League of German Maidens, and from 14 to 18.
The most influential leader of the BDM, Jutta Rüdiger, took it over in 1937 and stayed at the helm until Nazi Germany was crushed by the Allies in 1945. It didn't matter to Rüdiger that in accordance with Nazi policy, she would always be subordinate to the male leader of the Hitler Youth. As a pediatric psychologist, Rüdiger had the inside track on shaping impressionable young minds. She declared her intention to create what she called the new German woman, who would be the bearer of German culture and moral standards for the nation.
Part of the Nazi machinery was to put people in positions of power in ways that could be very useful. For example, Jutta Rüdiger, who was a pediatric psychologist, would be extremely useful in terms of indoctrinating young girls in the BDM.
First of all, it was a problem because she had a doctorate. And they didn't like the idea of women with doctorates, but she pointed out that her doctorate was in gymnastics. So they said, okay, she was really good. She was a terrific bureaucratic fighter.
While membership of the BDM eventually became compulsory, so powerful was the indoctrination that girls were willingly signing up in droves.
Even before 33, a lot of those young women joined secretly because they loved joining the Nazi Girls League. And they went off marching and they went to the party rallies, and the party rallies were mixed, unlike the schools, which were gender separated.
At weekly meetings, regular excursions, and annual summer camps, girls were indoctrinated with Nazi ideology. They were taught how so-called defective Jewish genes had weakened German stock. They were told that Jews were dangerous and lecherous, and that they should expect their men to protect them from the Jewish menace. Like every other aspect of life for women in Nazi Germany, this was all geared towards turning out compliant wives and mothers who would pass on their skills and attitudes to their Aryan children.
There was a great deal of emphasis on home economics. And so they learned sewing, and they also had very, very good education on maternal care and how to make sure that their health was protected. And those were very practical kinds of courses.
It's about mixing with other people that were of the same desirable level, so other German Aryans. Some of it was a bit educational, so in the case of the Bunddeutsche Mädel, learning how to be a good German woman, a good German wife and mother. And some of it was more practical, so they would do camping, things like that, so that they had more practical skills.
Their destiny was mapped out for them. As Rüdiger explained it, German girls were responsible for keeping the nation's blood pure. She was careful, however, to obscure the political purpose of the BDM because, like all good cults, its real appeal to its female membership was that it offered them a strong sense of comradeship and belonging.
Now, the sweetness with the camps they would go on, because this enabled them a sense of equality. They were going out into the hills, the forests in Germany, learning how to build fires, set snares to trap animals, and, of course, sleeping in tents of a night time. Just the things that the boys did, the youth boys did, so they were gaining some sense of equality.
But when war broke out in 1939, attitudes towards women underwent a dramatic change. When the air raid sirens began to sound, it turned out that the ideal woman in Germany was not a mother. She was a warrior. It was no longer about rearing the Aryan race. Instead, German women were expected to sacrifice for the fatherland. In keeping with the change of policy, Gertrude Schultz-Klink and the NSF urged women to get out of the kitchen and get back to work. It was, she said, a higher obligation. Women were expected to put their shoulders to the wheel as industry geared up for rearmament, and men rushed to join the armed forces.
Millions of men had been called up to fight, to be on the front line, and women were needed to replace them in vital roles. The German army couldn't function without these women to support them. And so it was a contradiction from the Nazi Party's earlier campaigns that women should stay at home and be good German mothers and good German wives. So the various organisations that women could join in the build-up to the war, such as the NS Frauenschaft or the Bund Deutscher Mädel, once the war broke out, this was a really good opportunity of an untapped resource.
With a female workforce of millions under her control, Jutta Rüdiger dispatched her BDM girls wherever they were needed on the home front. They were put to work in munitions factories and farms. Well-to-do girls from families with connections were pressed into office work. Getting women back into the workforce wasn't going to be enough, though. Soon Hitler would have to turn to female conscription. But he was concerned that conscripting German women had the potential to damage troop morale. He knew it didn't sit well with the soldiers at the front. They've been sold the story that they were fighting to protect the women who were keeping the home fires burning. But with the failure of Operation Barbarossa and Hitler's plan to create Lebensraum in the east by conquering the Soviet Union, the drain on manpower forced his hand, and the campaign to enlist women in the war effort accelerated.
Germany, it was in a dire situation, and even women were called to fight for the Führer. And like Hitler did say to one of the women, well, why shouldn't a woman have the right to fight for the Führer? Why should it be a man? If that woman can fight, let her do so, let them come. And this was the generally accepted position at that time. And the young girls of the Hitler Youth, they were given a Panzerfaust or a pistol. Anything that could cause a casualty to the enemy was seen as, yeah, this is what we have to do, especially as the Russians were nearing Berlin.
As the tides of war turned against Germany, all the promises the Nazi Party made to women would be broken. Ultimately, as the German war effort faltered, the Nazi women's leagues and girls' groups would be called to the front lines. But there was one more insult Hitler had in store for them. In the dying days of the war, Hitler and the Nazi Party, once staunch proponents of the women's place in the home, would call them to the front lines. But even in defeat, they hadn't abandoned their dream of creating an Aryan race to advance the aims of the future German Reich. The Nazi hierarchy had done the maths and concluded that Germany would have 4 million fertile women in surplus after the war, to fewer than 1 million men. Hitler wanted all remaining physically and mentally fit German men to impregnate as many women as possible before the end of the war. Himmler was all for the idea, and soon bigamy was even floated as an option.
Himmler told his men, when you go home on furlough, you come home from the Eastern Front, make sure you procreate as much as possible. And the wives had to just accept that their husbands had mistresses and multiple girlfriends.
And again, that's a little bit of a contradiction, because it was showing that marriage wasn't important, despite the fact that women earlier had been given loans to get married and support to get married and were encouraged to get married. But now, these high-ranking SS men were encouraged to take a second wife so that she could produce more German children.
Luckily for Hitler, the indoctrination of the Nazi youth had worked, and any resentment of the older population felt at the shifting goalposts was not shared by their Nazi children. Their daughters had been taught that Hitler came first. In the closing days of the war, this would have deadly consequences for hundreds of thousands of young Germans. In February 1945, it was proposed that the BDM members should form a women's battalion in a desperate bid to defend the Reich.
Nicht ein leerer Formalismus!
Several young BDM girls volunteered for the Volkssturm, or People's Storm, the civilian militia manned by old men, young boys and girls, as the Nazi fatherland's last line of defense.
They were taught how to create explosive devices, improvised explosive devices, how to set them up, where to position them. They were trained on, first of all, small, like air rifle type weapons, but then as they became more competent, they were using full-bore army rifles. And in fact, they would train how to use hand grenades.
One girl, aged just 15, recalled the moment Allied troops were marching towards her home in Aachen. When she asked for help from one of the many SS soldiers, he warned her that when the Russian soldiers arrived in the city, first they'd rape her, then they'd shoot her. Despite all Hitler's big talk, this was how Germany fell in the end, with teenage boys and girls laying down their lives for his psychotic ambition and craven ideology. During the last 4 months of the war, 700 Germans died every hour. Hitler's deluded refusal to admit defeat at the bitter end caused the death of an additional 1.2 million Germans, many of them the women and girls he'd sworn to protect. While the pride of Germany was being slaughtered in the streets, Hitler and his acolytes were cowering almost 30 feet below ground, beneath a 10-foot-thick concrete slab. Hiding in his bunker, Hitler had left his womenfolk to do the fighting for him. As the Reich fell, as many as 2 million German women were raped by Allied soldiers, most of them Russian.
This is perhaps the single most hardest part, because with Hitler's girls, sheer number of women who'd suffered serious sexual assault from the Russians, mostly being beaten up and raped.
The ghastly truth behind Nazi Germany's attitude to women found its expression in the horrific final chapter of Magda Goebbels' life. It became apparent that the depth of her much-celebrated familial devotion was paper-thin. Having done nothing to save her Jewish stepfather, a man who raised her and gave her his name, she resorted at the end to an act of even greater cruelty and evil. As Allied troops closed in on Berlin, the Goebbels family was sheltering with the Führer in his bunker. As it became clear that the war was lost, the First Lady of the Reich made a fateful decision. She wrote to her eldest son Harold, who was in a POW camp in North Africa, that a world without Hitler wasn't a world worth living in.
Magda was the symbol of motherhood with 7 children. Although I should say that in the very last days of the Reich, Magda and her husband poisoned all of those children, and they died in the bunker with Hitler. One escaped because he happened to be somewhere else.
Women in Nazi Germany were portrayed as the heart of the family and the foundations upon which the 1,000-year Reich was to be built. In fact, at the same time Hitler was championing mothers and wives as the most important people in Germany, his policies were aimed at eroding the very freedoms and rights that made them strong. The female Führers who worked with him to realize his dream of an Aryan nation helped bring Germany's women to their knees. But as the post-war dust settled on a nation that had been torn to pieces, it would be the widows, the mourning mothers, and the girl soldiers who would put Germany back together again.